May 27, 1942. The Pacific Ocean lay vast and deceptively peaceful, its blue expanse concealing the greatest naval trap ever prepared in modern warfare. Beneath that calm surface, in the unseen realm of intercepted radio signals and coded transmissions, an invisible war was already raging, a war of intellect, endurance, and pure nerve. At the heart of it stood a man few outside the Navy would ever know. Commander Joseph John Rochefort, the quiet, pipe-smoking chief of Station HYPO at Pearl Harbor, a converted basement buried under the 14th Naval District headquarters. There were no windows in HYPO, no sunlight, no uniforms pressed for parade. Just men in wrinkled shirts, chalk-stained blackboards, and the endless rattle of typewriters. On those walls hung nothing but maps of the Pacific, strings of intercepts, and the smell of coffee that had burned too long on the hot plate. They weren't soldiers. They weren't even seen as real officers by some in Washington. But they were about to alter the course of history. For months, Rochefort's cryptanalysts had been deciphering fragments of Japan's most secret communications system, the JN-25 code, a monstrous cipher composed of tens of thousands of number groups. Each group represented a word, a phrase, or a tactical order. To break even a small part of it demanded patience beyond comprehension. The Japanese Navy changed these codes frequently, replacing codebooks and additive tables in an attempt to stay ahead of American intelligence. Every reset meant starting from zero. But Rochefort's team was relentless. Men like Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, Joseph Finnegan, Wesley Wright, and a handful of linguists who could translate Japanese with uncanny speed. They worked 18-hour days, sleeping on cots between decoding sessions, eating sandwiches over sheets of intercepted ciphertext. The war was personal for them. Only 5 months earlier, the attack on Pearl Harbor had burned a scar across their island. Many of the men in that room had walked among the wreckage of Battleship Row, seen the smoke rising from the Arizona, and buried friends they couldn't save. Rochefort's mission was clear: it could never happen again. In April 1942, the Japanese military seemed unstoppable. They had swept across the Pacific, from the Philippines to Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and the Solomons. Their navy, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, had never suffered a decisive defeat. But now, in Tokyo, Yamamoto was preparing something even bolder, an operation that would destroy what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet once and for all. The plan, codenamed Operation MI, was to lure America's carriers into a trap near a place referred to in Japanese messages as AF. Rochefort intercepted the first hints in early May. The messages were vague: fleet movements, supply details, coded references. But a pattern began to emerge. AF kept reappearing. It was clearly the primary target of the operation, but its location remained uncertain. Washington believed AF referred to the Aleutian Islands, far to the north near Alaska. The reasoning was simple: a Japanese attack there would threaten the U.S. mainland and fit Japan's recent northern expansion. But Rochefort disagreed. After weeks of intercept analysis, he noticed something no one else did: the context of the messages, the direction of supply convoys, the frequencies used by Japanese stations, and even weather data reports. All of them pointed not north, but west. His conclusion was bold, even dangerous to his career. AF was Midway Atoll, a tiny, almost forgotten coral island halfway between Hawaii and Japan. To the average officer, Midway was insignificant, 2 small islands surrounded by reefs. But strategically it was priceless. From Midway, bombers could strike deep into the Central Pacific, and radar outposts could give early warning of any attack on Hawaii. If Japan captured it, Pearl Harbor itself would be within range of constant threat. Yet, despite Rochefort's conviction, Washington refused to believe him. The Navy's main intelligence division, OP-20G, dismissed HYPO's interpretation. Some called it speculative. Others quietly resented that Rochefort's small, ragtag team in Hawaii was outperforming the well-funded cryptanalysts in Washington. The dispute reached all the way up the chain of command, to Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, and to Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. King wanted proof. Nimitz trusted intuition, but proof was what would move ships. So Rochefort devised a plan, a deception so simple it bordered on genius. He ordered that Midway's radio station send out an uncoded message, something the Japanese would definitely intercept. The message stated that Midway's freshwater condenser had broken and the island was running short on potable water. 2 days later, Japanese intercepts carried a report back to Tokyo. AF is short of water. The room at HYPO erupted. The trap was set. AF was Midway beyond doubt. Now Nimitz could plan. The Americans would not wait to be ambushed. Instead, they would ambush the ambushers. 3 aircraft carriers, the USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown, were ordered to sail from Pearl Harbor to the northwest, to lie in wait north of Midway. It was a gamble of terrifying proportions. If Rochefort was wrong, those ships, and their thousands of men, would be alone in the vast Pacific, vulnerable to attack. But Nimitz trusted him completely. "Tell Rochefort," he reportedly said, "that the battle will be fought where he says it will be fought." That faith would soon prove justified. By the last week of May 1942, HYPO's intercepts confirmed everything: the exact date of the attack, June 4th, the composition of the Japanese fleet, and even the order of battle. Yamamoto's forces would approach Midway in multiple waves: a carrier strike force to hit the island, a battleship group to destroy the U.S. fleet once it appeared, and a northern diversionary attack on the Aleutians. To the outside world, it still seemed the Japanese were invincible. But in the underground rooms of Pearl Harbor, Rochefort's team had already stripped their secrecy bare. Every encrypted message they sent now revealed not strength, but vulnerability. As the Japanese armada steamed toward Midway, unaware their every move was being watched, Rochefort's team grew silent. The tension was unlike anything they had experienced before. They knew the fate of the Pacific, perhaps even the war, rested on whether their analysis was right. At 7:10 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the first Japanese aircraft appeared over Midway. The island's radar picked them up, exactly as HYPO had predicted. The defenders scrambled to intercept. Bombs fell, smoke rose, and from the north, American carrier planes were already en route. Rochefort's work was done. Now history would play out. Over the next hours, the skies above Midway turned into an inferno. Dive bombers plunged almost vertically through clouds of anti-aircraft fire. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were set ablaze and destroyed. The Battle of Midway was over. The Japanese Navy had lost its core-striking power: 4 fleet carriers, over 250 aircraft, and many of its most experienced pilots. The balance of the Pacific had shifted. And yet few outside that dimly lit room beneath Pearl Harbor realized that the first and greatest victory had been won before the battle began, in silence, through patience, and by a handful of men who read what others could not. Despite his decisive role, Joseph Rochefort received no medals, no honors. In Washington, certain officers, jealous of his success, quietly moved against him. He was reassigned to a desk job in San Francisco. No public explanation was given. For years, his contribution to the Battle of Midway was buried in classified archives. Only those who had served under Nimitz or in the cryptographic community truly knew the truth. That a single radio man, a quiet, eccentric genius, had cracked Japan's most secret code, predicted their most ambitious plan, and saved the Pacific Fleet from destruction. The Pacific was quiet again. The wrecks of 4 Japanese carriers rested on the ocean floor, their decks scorched, their aircraft scattered like ashes across the waves. But in the aftermath of triumph came something darker: politics, envy, and the quiet dismantling of the very man who had made the victory possible. In Washington, success has many fathers, and failure is an orphan. But in wartime intelligence, the reverse is often true: victories are buried beneath secrecy, and those who achieve them vanish into the shadows. For Commander Joseph J. Rochefort, the man who read Japan's naval mind, Midway was not just the high point of his career, it was the beginning of his professional exile. Only days after the battle, the official reports began circulating. Admiral Nimitz praised his codebreakers publicly but cautiously. In Washington's corridors of power, the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, and OP-20G, the Navy's main communications intelligence unit, claimed much of the credit. Rochefort's small station HYPO, out in distant Hawaii, far from the bureaucratic spotlight, became an inconvenient detail in the official story. Behind closed doors, senior officers like Rear Admiral Joseph Redman and his brother Captain John Redman began whispering to their superiors that Rochefort's methods were irregular, that his analysis lacked discipline, that he had lucked into success. It was professional sabotage, motivated not by reason, but resentment. They could not tolerate that a self-taught maverick, a man in a bathrobe working in a basement, had succeeded where their polished Washington teams had failed. By late 1942, Rochefort was quietly relieved of command at Station HYPO. No ceremony, no thank you. Just a transfer order to San Francisco, where he would serve as a technical advisor for ship repair, a job far beneath his intellect. When Admiral Nimitz heard the news, he was furious. "This is the biggest mistake the Navy ever made," he told his staff. But even Nimitz's authority couldn't overturn the decision. Washington had made up its mind. Rochefort, loyal to the end, refused to protest. "If that's where they need me," he said simply, "then that's where I'll go." He never again worked in cryptanalysis. Meanwhile, in the dim rooms of HYPO, his team continued decoding, but the heart had gone out of the operation. The war ground on through the Solomons, the Marianas, Leyte, and finally Okinawa. Each campaign relied, in part, on the foundation Rochefort had built. His methods of collaborative analysis, combining linguists, traffic analysts, mathematicians, and radio interceptors, became the model for American signals intelligence. But his name faded from view. When the war ended in 1945, America celebrated its victories: the Marines on Iwo Jima, the soldiers in Europe, the pilots who dropped the atomic bombs. The codebreakers remained silent. Their work was classified for decades, their contributions hidden behind the black walls of secrecy. For Rochefort, the years after the war were quiet but dignified. He lived in Los Angeles with his wife and children, occasionally teaching, often reading, but rarely speaking of his service. He knew what he had done. That was enough, or so he told himself. But among his wartime comrades, especially Captain Edwin Layton, Admiral Nimitz's intelligence officer, the injustice burned deeply. Layton had seen Rochefort's genius firsthand. He had watched him piece together fragments of intercepted numbers and turn them into a complete operational map of Japan's fleet, something no one else on Earth could have done. He made it his mission to restore Rochefort's honor. Layton began quietly collecting documents, correspondence, and decrypted messages. He wrote memos to Navy historians and lobbied for years for official recognition of Rochefort's work. But the bureaucracy was immovable. As long as the wartime intercepts remained classified, the evidence could not be released. Without it, recognition would remain impossible. And so decades passed. Rochefort aged gracefully, if privately. He rarely spoke of the war except to deflect praise. "We all just did our jobs," he would say. But those who knew him understood what he had sacrificed, not just years of exhaustion, but his reputation, his standing, and the public honor he had earned. He died on July 20, 1976, in Torrance, California, still unrecognized by the Navy he had served so brilliantly. He was 76 years old. But the story didn't end there. In the late 1970s, America began to unseal its cryptologic past. The National Security Agency, NSA, created in 1952, started releasing declassified studies of World War II code breaking. The truth came out, not only about Britain's Bletchley Park and Alan Turing's Enigma triumph, but about the Pacific War's unsung counterpart, Station HYPO and its victory over JN-25. For the first time, historians could see the scale of what Rochefort's team had accomplished. They hadn't just cracked a code, they had unlocked an entire enemy command system. They could read Japanese fleet orders, logistics messages, weather reports, even casualty lists. They had given the U.S. Navy an omniscient view of Japan's intentions, a feat no other intelligence service had matched. The revelation astonished scholars. Midway, it turned out, had not been a miracle of luck. It had been the triumph of intelligence. As new books appeared, the campaign for Rochefort's recognition reignited. One of its loudest advocates was Admiral Donald Mac Showers, a veteran of naval intelligence and later the CIA. Showers, who had served under Rochefort, knew firsthand how much the man had accomplished. He began lobbying Navy Secretary John Lehman in the early 1980s, presenting documentation that left no doubt Rochefort's work had been decisive to the victory at Midway. The case was undeniable. And finally, 44 years after the battle, the recognition came. On May 30, 1986, at a White House ceremony, President Ronald Reagan posthumously awarded Commander Joseph J. Rochefort the Distinguished Service Medal. His children accepted it on his behalf. The citation read, "For sustained superior performance in the conduct of cryptologic and intelligence operations, which contributed in large measure to the victory of United States forces at Midway." It was a simple statement, too simple, perhaps, for what it truly represented. Rochefort's work had not merely contributed to victory. It had made victory possible. But history, once buried, tends to grow richer when unearthed. As more declassified files emerged, historians began connecting the Pacific's hidden intelligence war to the global evolution of cryptanalysis. The lessons learned at Station HYPO, collaboration, cross-disciplinary thinking, and technical innovation, became cornerstones of modern intelligence work. Where Bletchley Park had pioneered machine cryptanalysis through the bomb and later Colossus, HYPO had demonstrated the power of human ingenuity, a fusion of math, language, and intuition that no machine could replicate. Their methods evolved into the analytical frameworks used by the NSA during the Cold War, and eventually into the computer-driven signal intelligence of the digital age. But behind every algorithm and intercept database lay the ghost of that windowless basement at Pearl Harbor, and the men who worked themselves to exhaustion under its flickering lights. "Knowledge is power," Rochefort had once said. But he proved something deeper, that knowledge, used wisely and courageously, could change the course of a war. He had done what seemed impossible. He read the enemy's mind. And in doing so, he changed history. In war, the heroes you never see often shape the battles you remember. For decades after Midway, the public imagination was filled with carrier decks, dogfights, and desperate charges, the visible war. But the real struggle for victory began in unseen rooms filled with static, numbers, and noise. And at the heart of that struggle was a quiet revolution, a revolution born from Joseph Rochefort's basement at Pearl Harbor. The story of that revolution begins not with machines, but with minds. In 1941, the field of cryptanalysis was more art than science. Codes were broken not by formula, but by instinct, by men and women who could look at a string of meaningless characters and feel the pattern within. Rochefort's Station HYPO embodied that spirit. There were no computers. Only hand-cranked calculators, chalkboards, and endless printouts of intercepted signals from radio operators scattered across the Pacific. Each transmission was a piece of a puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. But day after day, night after night, Rochefort's team kept at it, charting frequencies, counting patterns, and building fragments into structure. They didn't have a playbook. They invented one. Their innovations, traffic analysis, parallel decryption, contextual inference, became the backbone of post-war signals intelligence. After the war, as America entered the nuclear age, the Navy and Army's cryptologic units merged into what would eventually become the National Security Agency. The techniques Rochefort had pioneered were codified into official doctrine. Collect first, analyze continuously. Cross-triangulate intelligence sources. Combine linguistic, mathematical, and contextual reasoning. What had begun as improvisation in a basement had become the operating philosophy of an entire intelligence empire. Even in the age of satellites and computers, Rochefort's fingerprints remained. His belief that context is the key to code shaped how analysts approached encryption, from Cold War Soviet intercepts to digital cyber defense. And his greatest lesson of all, that intellect could outweigh firepower, became the central principle of modern warfare. But the story wasn't just institutional. It was profoundly human. In the years following his death, Rochefort's surviving team members, men like Commander Wesley Wright, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, and Joseph Finnegan, began to reconnect, sharing memories that had been sealed away for 40 years. At their reunions, they spoke not of glory, but of fatigue. They remembered the constant exhaustion, the coffee-stained papers, the headaches that came from decoding 12-hour shifts without rest. They remembered writing messages to Nimitz at 2 a.m, knowing that one misplaced assumption could send entire fleets to their deaths. They remembered how, when the code AF was finally confirmed to mean Midway, they didn't cheer, they simply exhaled and went back to work. Because they knew the battle hadn't been won yet. At those gatherings, someone would always mention Rochefort. Usually softly, almost reverently. The consensus was the same: he had been their compass. He never ordered. He persuaded. He never demanded obedience, only truth. If someone disagreed with his analysis, he welcomed it. "Prove me wrong," he would say. And if they did, he would grin, not in pride, but in relief. To him, accuracy mattered more than ego. And in the high-stakes world of intelligence, that made him a rarity. By the 1990s, declassification had brought Rochefort's name into the history books. Authors like Elliot Carlson, Craig Simons, and John Prados began chronicling the behind-the-scenes war of information. For the first time, the public understood that the Pacific War was not just a clash of ships and men, it was a duel of intelligence systems, of signals and counter-signals, of deception and decipherment. And in that duel, the United States had held a secret weapon: Rochefort's mind. The Japanese, too, eventually learned of the scope of his achievement. After the war, surviving officers of the Imperial Navy admitted their disbelief at how precisely the Americans had predicted their movements. They had assumed spies were embedded in their ranks. The truth, that their own encrypted messages had been read for months, stunned them. In Tokyo's post-war intelligence circles, Rochefort's name became a whispered legend. One Japanese naval historian later wrote, "He was the invisible admiral who commanded no fleet but decided every battle." Today, in the archives of the U.S. Navy's Cryptologic History Division, you can still see fragments of Rochefort's wartime world. There are stacks of weathered code sheets labeled JN25, scrawled with pencil notations. There are intercepted messages decoded by hand, each line marked with the initials of the cryptanalyst who cracked it. And in the margins of one file, a faint note in Rochefort's handwriting reads, "Truth is never convenient, but always necessary." It was a fitting epitaph for a man who served truth above all. In 2000, nearly 60 years after Midway, the U.S. Navy honored Rochefort again, this time by naming a building after him at the National Security Agency's Cryptologic Center in Maryland. The Joseph J. Rochefort Building stands today as a silent monument to a man who once worked in anonymity, his genius hidden behind layers of classification. Inside its walls, young analysts study the very principles he discovered: pattern recognition, operational security, and the psychology of enemy communication. Every day, without knowing it, they continue his work. The legacy of Joseph Rochefort reaches even further than intelligence or war. It is a reminder of how human imagination, when combined with discipline and courage, can alter the fate of nations. He was not a general, not a politician, not a man who commanded armies. He was, in every sense, a thinker, a scholar of patterns, of language, of the invisible mathematics of war. Yet his intellect sank fleets, saved thousands, and shortened a global conflict. When we look back at the Second World War, it is easy to see only the spectacle, the explosions, the invasions, the flags raised over victory. But in truth, the war was won not only on the beaches or in the skies, it was won in small rooms filled with minds that refused to give up. In those rooms, amid static and uncertainty, men like Joseph Rochefort built the foundation of a new kind of warfare, one fought with information instead of bullets, with logic instead of artillery, and with patience instead of pride. May 27, 1942. The day that began as a test of intuition became a turning point in history. Because one man, working in a sealed room beneath Pearl Harbor, dared to believe that the impossible could be solved, that the enemy's secrets could be read before the first shot was fired. He gave the U.S. Navy the most precious gift in war, foreknowledge. And through that gift, he helped turn the tide of the Pacific, saved untold lives, and showed that sometimes the greatest victories are won not by strength, but by intellect. As the film of history reels forward, from Midway to the digital age, from hand-cranked calculators to quantum encryption, the lesson remains unchanged. Knowledge, courage, and persistence can rewrite destiny. And in the story of World War II, no one embodied that truth more completely than the man who cracked the uncrackable, Commander Joseph John Rochefort.